But on this episode, I want to focus on three main things that are still missing. When we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, we are a long way. If we want to be realistic about what we're facing, and we're facing the largest government in history, we are a long way from where the old revolutionaries were in the years 1760 through 1775. I should mention that if you want to follow along with the stuff that I'm mentioning, other episodes, original source documents, articles, and the like, I publish a blog post about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done, and there you can find a show links section. So when you're thinking, Bolden, where's that episode you were talking about from last Wednesday? You will find a link to it there. And speaking of that last week Wednesday episode, Recipe for Revolution, I started out that episode talking about how the real American Revolution, some conversation back and forth with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in the 1800s, the real American Revolution started many years before the War for Independence. Thomas Jefferson said, this was the American mind. This was the harmonizing sentiments of the day. So this was a radical change in the views of the people, and I highlighted 4 of the main principles underlying that revolution in thought. That is liberty based in natural rights, sovereignty of the people, that means final authority. So the people have final authority, government doesn't. That means a constitution created by the people, written or unwritten, for that government supersedes the government. The government doesn't get to decide whether or not the government has gone beyond the limits of the rules given to the government by the sovereign people. And so that's an important part of it. Opposition to unlimited centralized power. And a line in the sand, though, you have to be able to stop the government from doing the stuff that the government was not supposed to be doing, rather than begging it to stop itself. And that's done through noncompliance and resistance. And I'm pretty sure you and I are going to be on board with pretty much all of these, depending on the scenario. But real talk, there is something that's still missing if we want a real American Revolution once again, and it's much bigger than you and I. Let's first of all get back to Thomas Jefferson in this great letter to Henry Lee, which I cited last week as well. But he's talking about the object of the Declaration of Independence. Here in 1825, writing to Henry Lee, he says, was not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject. So this wasn't a Jeffersonian. This wasn't Thomas Jefferson and the Committee of Five. This wasn't them just telling everyone else how they were supposed to feel. This is Thomas Jefferson taking the approach of, let's look at the landscape of the political views of the people of these 13 free and independent states, well, after that declaration, I guess, and share with the world what our harmonizing sentiments are. He said it was intended to be an expression of the American mind. This is the Declaration of Independence. And to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion, all its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day. So it was commonly held by the people of the day that liberty based in natural rights in opposition to centralized power and resistance to keep a government claiming unlimited power against them was the tool to stop them. Here's John Adams in a letter to Hezekiah Niles with a very similar view, February 13, 1818. He points out that there were these harmonizing sentiments, but even then, we try to think of today how there's so many differences in viewpoints between, well, I live in California. I have hugely different viewpoints than everyone I run into pretty much everywhere. But here in Southern California especially, and when I lived in downtown Los Angeles, even more so, I would get calls from friends who wanted to talk about some current event thing. Hey, I know you're kind of crazy about these weird views and stuff. But if they wanted to talk, they always thought that I would be the one to have conversations with. But back at the time of the Revolution, we often kind of get the impression that, they all had this kind of same viewpoint. And they did have a harmonizing sentiment of the day in support of liberty. But that was also unusual. And John Adams explains why. He said the colonies had grown up under constitutions of government so different. There was so great a variety of religions. They were composed of so many different nations. Their customs, manners, and habits had so little resemblance, and their intercourse had been so rare. So this is not a super interconnected society at the time. Each state, each colony certainly had their own traditions, political, economic, religious viewpoints. very much like we have today. California and Montana are going to be very different, although I know from friends who live in Montana, they tell me to stop telling my California friends about how nice Montana or Idaho is because they keep ruining it. California and South Carolina and Texas are very different. Massachusetts and Nebraska are very different. So we have the same type of thing today. Maybe it's more extreme. I don't know. I'm not one who studied these types of things, but John Adams certainly did, and he was pointing out that at the time of the Revolution, 1760 to 1775, and the years before that, the people had a huge difference in viewpoints, but still they came together. He said, their knowledge of each other was so imperfect that to unite them in the same principles in theory and in the same system of action was certainly a very difficult enterprise. So the principles in theory, which I mentioned, those main four, and there are others as well, but those are the four that I think are important to highlight. But to bring them together in thought and in action was very difficult. He said the complete accomplishment of it in so short of a time and by such simple means was perhaps a singular example in the history of mankind. 13 clocks were made to strike together, a perfection of mechanism which no artist had ever before affected. Remember, these were not the people of 13 counties of one united nation, one singular nation in the modern sense. These were people who lived in totally different countries on the same large landmass, and their histories and their viewpoints certainly connected on that. So it was very rare throughout history to see this type of bond. So I think at best, understanding this kind of foundation, we're not in the height of a new American Revolution today, a new revolution in thought. We're not even really close. We're literally surrounded by tens of millions of people. Now, I tend to focus on the positive in a lot of the work that we do. Our State of the Nullification Movement report often focuses on even the smallest steps moving forward. Sometimes we set aside some of those small steps, and I am a little cynical about those things. And I tend to be very cynical in the short term, but in the long run, I do believe in liberty and its opportunity, its chance of winning. But we today, here in the United States, these United States of America, we are literally surrounded by tens and tens of millions of people who are not only clueless about these foundational principles of the original real American Revolution, they know nothing about them. They think a lot of times the American Revolution was just about some taxes on tea, even though people like John Hancock specifically told us that the taxes on tea were just an example of how they exercised unlimited centralized power in all cases whatsoever under the Declaratory Act. So they don't learn these things, or they're totally opposed to them. They love centralized power when they get their own way out of it. They oppose it when they don't. So they're their goals-based views. They don't actually have a foundation in support of liberty in and of itself as the goal, no matter what you can show to be the result of supporting it. So we don't have 50 clocks, and we definitely don't even have 13 striking as one. So I want to focus on a few things here, some viewpoints here from Thomas Jefferson in a letter to George Washington in 1786. He says, "Our liberty can never be safe." Oh, I should pull this up on the screen. I still want to just look at my face this whole time. Our liberty can never be safe but in the hands of the people themselves. And on the one hand, Jefferson is correct. He wrote elsewhere, a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate. So if you're going to be free, it's up to the people to learn how to live free, whether the government wants them to or not. John Dickinson told us that defending the Constitution is up to the supreme sovereignty of the people, not relying on the government to somehow magically limit its own power. James Madison told us the same. You want to stop the feds, you have to use a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. So on the one hand, it's up to the people to protect their own constitution and their own liberty, whether the government wants them to or not. But on the other hand, if the people are ignorant of their own history, they don't like liberty, they don't love liberty, they don't know anything about it, then you've got a kind of a problem. Because if it really is up to the people and the people aren't on board with freedom, we run into this issue. Jefferson points out again, here's a letter to Charles Yancey. If a nation, Yancey, my accent comes through every now and then, Midwesterner. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. So if we're going to be ignorant about freedom, about liberty, about our history, about the nature and source of power and the problems with it, then there will be no freedom. So though you and I are always trying to learn more and more, and much of what I do on this show, I'm learning and sharing it with you as I go. I'm trying to improve my knowledge of history. Many people are not. And unfortunately, we know that we're not going to have freedom, as Thomas Jefferson said, in an ignorant society. Here's Benjamin Rush. Freedom can only exist in the society of knowledge. Without learning, men are incapable of knowing their rights. Human beings are not going to understand. Well, then, of course, we can have a whole side conversation about government schools, government-run schools. And unfortunately, some of these quotes here are kind of in the context of supporting the state actually helping advance knowledge. But we know today that's probably a very, very bad choice. So freedom can only exist in the society of knowledge. The foundational principle is there. We have a lot of knowledge. We have a lot of information. There are tons of schools and tons of funding going to those schools. But most of what we're getting is spoon-fed propaganda. But there is true, real history, real information out there. And as Abigail Adams put it to her young son, John Quincy, in 1780, learning is not attained by chance. It must be sought for with ardor and attended to with diligence. So I think of the three main things that I wanted to focus on today, I'll do them in kind of a countdown order. Number 3, we live in an age of information, but we also live in an age of incredible ignorance of underlying true history, of actual information. People are happy to just take whatever is spoon-fed and told to them, and they're lazy about it, and they don't go any further. People don't know their history. They don't know anything about the original legal meaning of the Constitution. They don't know anything about the foundational principles of the American Revolution, how it's supposed to be, why things are. I could go on and on and on. So we live in an age of ignorance, and until that changes, we've got a major uphill battle. Next up, John Hancock, I think, bridges a couple of these statements, these views that I'm looking at. He says, surely you will never tamely suffer this country to be a den of thieves. Remember, my friends, from whom you sprang. And this is from his great massacre or Boston Massacre Day oration of March 5th, 1774. So on the one hand, he's telling us, remember your history, remember where things come from. But on the same token, at the same time, he's saying, well, if we all know that people with power will always try to expand their power. Everyone should know this at some point. And maybe you and I know this, but unfortunately, a lot of other people don't. On the other hand, we have to recognize that just yelling at politicians, waving documents at them, going to their courts and asking their courts to stop them from doing the stuff they weren't supposed to ever do in the first place. Maybe once in a while you can get it to work, but that's not how a free people lives. A free people, as I mentioned, Thomas Jefferson, very clear, claim their rights as derived from natural law, natural right, as the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate. And Hancock here is pointing out that, well, when government does stuff that they're not supposed to do, are you going to sit idly by and be tame and just submit to what they do and allow them to, well, destroy freedom? Unfortunately, that has absolutely happened for generations. We've got generation upon generation of people who have believed that the way to stop the government from doing things is, well, by tamely submitting, waiting for the right people to get in office or the right people to get on the court and to do the right thing. And then we have generations come and go, and things keep getting worse and worse and worse. And now we live under the largest government in history. Benjamin Franklin, in a letter to James Bowdoin, February 1775, also talking about tame compliance. He said, if we tamely give up our rights in this contest, a century to come will not restore us in the opinion of the world. And this was just before Lexington and Concord that Franklin wrote that. Here's James Otis Jr., which I think he really hammers this one home the best. There is nothing. To James Otis Jr., the man who we can look at as potentially kicking off the controversy between the colonies and Great Britain in 1761 with his great speech against the writs of assistance, arguing against general warrants, mass warrantless surveillance of today. He says there is nothing, this is not in that speech, this is in 1767, but he's an important figure in the early part of the American Revolution. There is nothing that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. I covered this viewpoint of the founders and old revolutionaries in its own episode back in November, Top 4 Roadblocks to Liberty, the TLDW, too long didn't watch. It isn't a super long episode, maybe 30 minutes or so. But all 4 of the top 4 reasons are based on James Otis's view here. As long as people continue to comply with government acts and edicts and orders and regulations, there's no reason for government to stop doing them, and there's no reason for government to stop adding more. As John Dickinson put it in his great broadside urging resistance and noncompliance to the Stamp Act, he basically said, this is basically a test of your disposition. As long as you will bend your neck to that yoke, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, you are proving yourselves worthy to take whatever your lords and masters shall decide to subject you to. So number 3 is we live in an age of ignorance. Countdown to number 2. We live in an era where there is a prevailing opinion that it's better to tamely submit. And I think it comes across from one of 2 core reasons. One, a lot of people love what government does. And unfortunately, I think most people who dislike what government does, they tend to only dislike it based on a party affiliation. Like, they're okay with centralized power to force their political views on the people of all 50 states, whether or not the Constitution allows it, and in almost every situation, it doesn't, as long as their team is doing it. And then they oppose the stuff that the other team does. And sometimes the faction-first mentality, which Noah Webster told us would be totally destructive to liberty, I shouldn't get too much into a side note there, but I want to point out that a lot of times you'll even find out that what people support and oppose, they can support one thing, and when the other team does the same thing in principle, then suddenly they oppose it. We like it when they oppose government power, but when it's a flip-flop approach, it's pretty bad. So people think it's better to tamely submit and wait to get new people in office to do things the way they want them to do it. And so on the one hand, they like what government does. On the other hand, they want to wait to get government to stop doing things they shouldn't have been doing all along. So we live in an era where the prevailing opinion, not from everyone, but the vast majority of people believe it's better to tamely submit. Sometimes they're afraid. Sometimes it's too dangerous. Sometimes they see the largest government in history, and they rightly believe that that largest government in history is a violent, dangerous creature. Anyway, so that's number 2, tamely submitting, and I will link to that other episode in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now, for the last one here, if you follow me on Twitter, and you should, you'll find some entertaining stuff from here and there. Sometimes I'm sharing pictures at home, but whatever. I oftentimes will rail against people who only seem to frame their support for the Constitution or liberty or both in utilitarian ways. Basically, it will provide better results, they claim, for what many of the statists want to accomplish by using government. Now, a lot of times I agree, yes, you can get better results. I think we will live in a safer society when, as Patrick Henry said, the object is to have everyone armed. So I agree with things like that, and I can say yes, but I think in the long run, it really is a very bad message, because if we're only focusing on the end results, it's pretty easy for the opposition to frame the argument, and they can overwhelm the education system and the airwaves and just the messaging out there on the internet, because they have basically all the establishment pillars of society. They can easily overwhelm that. I think we really need to, even though it probably is a much longer haul, I think we need to advance liberty for liberty's sake, whether or not we can prove that liberty will provide a statist mentality the better results for what the statist wants. If we can prove that free market education is going to give people a better education, that's a very hard argument to make. We want it to be free market because we can't trust government. We need to advance liberty for the sake of advancing liberty. We want people to have the choice rather than the control of things. So I think the only way we're going to have a real American revolution happening once again, a revolution, a radical change in the views of the people, is, well, first of all, on the one hand, if we're focusing on liberty for liberty's sake rather than perceived or real results from having liberty. And then, as I'm mentioning in this quick side note, also we got to get government out of education, but that's a side note. Anyways, here's George Washington in his circular to the states of June 1783. He talks about liberty being the basis. Liberty is the foundation of what we're searching for here. It's not results-based. It is the result that we should be aiming for in and of itself. Here's Thomas Paine in his dissertation on the first principles government. I think it's 1795. I'll get the link in the show notes. He says, "He that would make his own liberty secure must guard even his enemy from oppression." If we only care about the results of something, this is not a mentality that we're gonna be in favor of. If we only care about what liberty produces rather than liberty in and of itself, if our goal is liberty, if our primary object is liberty, we don't care who's getting that liberty. We're supporting liberty for liberty's sake. And even when we can't show that liberty is better than the status paradigm that we live on, we're still on board with more liberty. And that's how Thomas Jefferson put it in a letter to Archibald Stuart in 1791. He said, "I would rather be exposed to the inconveniences attending too much liberty than those attending too small a degree of it." Or as Patrick Henry really hammered it home, liberty is the primary object. He was debating in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, June 5th, 1788. He said, "When the American spirit was in its youth, the language of America was different. Liberty, sir, was then the primary object." And I think that's the most important thing. And I know I included liberty based on natural rights in last Wednesday's show. In case you haven't seen it, or if you want to again, of course, I will link to that in the show notes. But I think it really needs a constant emphasis for a huge majority of people today. And I don't think it's even close. Liberty is not the primary object. We do not have 13 clocks striking as one. We don't have 50 striking as one, where the vast majority of the people in each of these, well, supposedly free and independent states, but really more like vassal states of the federal or national empire that is Washington, D.C., liberty is not the primary object. And for most, it's not even on their radar. They don't even think about liberty when it comes to what they're talking about, what they're proposing. It's not about freedom. It's about a goals base. Now, I may, again, be cynical in the short term, but in the long run, I am very optimistic. We've got a long, long road ahead, but a real revolution is not something that is going to be quick or easy. And John Adams put it this way in that same letter to Hezekiah Niles. He says we should study the history of 1760 through 1775 to understand what they were doing, their strategy, their principles, their viewpoints. Why? He said the means and measures are the proper objects of investigation. They may teach mankind that revolutions are no trifles, that they ought never to be undertaken rashly, nor without deliberate consideration and sober reflection, nor without a solid, immutable, eternal foundation of justice and humanity, of course, based in liberty. Now, we hear words like that today, and of course, a lot of people are like, yeah, we're on board with that, with a global governing regime of some sorts. So they twist it. It's not a complete education. They may even know things like this, but they twist it into their own means. Centralized, unlimited centralized power. Adams continues. He says, "Nor without a people possessed of intelligence, fortitude, and integrity sufficient to carry them with steadiness, patience, and perseverance through all the vicissitudes of fortune, the fiery trials and melancholy disasters they may have to encounter." So revolutions, a revolution in thought, a radical change in the views of the people is not something that happens quickly. It takes a very, very dedicated people willing to make sacrifices in support of it, and they have to be really based in a strong foundation, which we don't have. But then again, I still do have hope for the future. As Thomas Jefferson pointed out to the Reverend Charles Clay, He said, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches, that we must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. And he said, it takes time to persuade men to do even what is for their own good. And I think, and I've talked about this in some speeches over the years, for example, my PorcFest keynote speech at maybe a decade ago, I basically made the case that, some people will learn, and they learn to support the Constitution, they support liberty and freedom by showing them videos and articles and books and all kinds of memes and just interesting stuff, reading, giving them the information. And while some people may be interested in that, where people actually learn is they learn by example, and they learn by seeing things play out in practice. So even though a vast majority of the country is terrible on, I would say all the states are terrible on the natural right to keep and bear arms. Some of them are improving and getting less bad. We're not going to see places like New York and California make any radical changes on this in the immediate future. But it is possible to show them through example over time. What is a generation to come going to learn when a state like Missouri or a state like Arizona, where they have more expansive protections for the natural right to self-defense, and the world doesn't come to an end? In fact, nothing that they promised us would happen with more liberty comes to pass, and then people learn and they do things the other way. We saw this play out with cannabis in the last 15 to 20 years as well. When I first started talking about the 10th Amendment movement, and I talked to Tea Party groups and Republican groups and right-wing groups, and I would talk about how, you got to follow the cannabis example. Basically, it doesn't matter if the feds say something is legal, if you think it should be, or if they say it's illegal. If you think it should be legal for people to use, to buy, to sell, you just do it anyway. And in some places, I would get laughed out of the room. Like, that's never going to happen. And yet today, the reddest of the red states are on board, and we're seeing how the federal government is going to have to back down just to save face. It takes a long time to convince people what is even for their own good. I think Thomas Jefferson was unsurprisingly right once again. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. It's more of a kind of a ramble or a rant than a really formatted than usual. But I hope you found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope it encourages you to learn a little bit more on your own time. Of course, I will link to all this stuff in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Israel over in the chat says, I don't want safety, I need liberty. Yeah, it's not give me liberty or, make me feel safe and secure. That's a different phrase, right? If you want total security, Eisenhower, I think, once said, go to prison. That's where you're going to be fed and clothed and housed and protected, even though they can't even do that in government-run prisons. I should mention that if you want to help us get these types of foundational principles out to more and more people, nothing helps us get that job done more every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And I really, really appreciate any support you can give us today. Burnin' Rubber has a great comment over on YouTube. Teach your kids to learn and think on their own, and they'll know more than the leading scholars. I find, and I'm only average, I think, in my intelligence. I'm maybe on the higher end of average if I want to just, kind of roll with that. But I certainly was propagandized right from birth. I believe that the solution to every problem, whether it was caused by government or not, was government itself. You needed more government power. And I've broken away from that in many ways today. And if I feel like if I can get away from that type of thinking through the propaganda I was given, living in a very socialist environment, I don't think my parents ever would have actually subscribed to that. But certainly the schooling system I was in was part of that structure. If I can get away from that, I think anyone can. It just takes what Abigail Adams said. You have to actually search out knowledge, and we need to have that type of motivation today. Anyways, I'm rambling at this point. Again, I appreciate you being here. I hope you had an awesome weekend. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.